The dust kicked up by the convoy's wheels created a brown cloud that followed the military vehicles through the narrow streets of Fallujah. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez gripped his rifle tighter as their Humvee navigated another pothole. The Iraqi city had become a place where danger lurked around every corner, and today felt different somehow. The air seemed heavier, more threatening than usual. "Contact ahead," crackled through the radio. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, leading the patrol from the front vehicle. She had been in Iraq for 8 months now, and her instincts had kept her team alive through countless missions. Something in her tone made everyone in the convoy sit up straighter. The SEAL team had been tasked with a routine reconnaissance mission. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target was hiding in a compound 3 blocks from their current position. The plan was simple: get in, gather information, and get out without being detected. But in Fallujah, simple plans rarely stayed simple. As they turned onto Al-Hadra Street, the familiar sounds of the city seemed muted. No children playing in the dusty yards. No vendors calling out their wares. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed the streets had disappeared. The silence was deafening, and it made Rodriguez's skin crawl. "This doesn't feel right," whispered Corporal Tommy Washington from the back seat. He was the youngest member of their unit, barely 22, but he had developed the same sixth sense that kept soldiers alive in combat zones. His eyes darted from window to window, searching for any sign of movement. The convoy slowed as they approached an intersection where several buildings had been damaged by previous fighting. Concrete barriers and burned-out cars created a maze that forced vehicles to move in single file. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Chen's voice came through the radio again, calmer this time but with an edge of concern. "We've got civilians in the target building. Looks like a family." Intelligence didn't mention non-combatants. Through his binoculars, Rodriguez could see what she was talking about. In a second-story window of the target building, a woman held a small child while an older man stood beside them. They weren't trying to hide, which was unusual in a city where most families stayed indoors during military operations. "Could be a setup," suggested Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the team leader. He had served 3 tours in Iraq and had seen every trick insurgents use to gain an advantage. Families sometimes get forced to stay put when fighters want to use human shields. The woman in the window caught Rodriguez's attention. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair covered by a colorful headscarf. She held the child protectively, but her eyes weren't filled with the fear he usually saw in civilians during military operations. Instead, she seemed to be watching them with curiosity, even concern. "We need to check it out," Chen decided. "If there are civilians, we need to know. Can't risk innocent casualties on a recon mission." The team dismounted their vehicles and began approaching the building on foot. Rodriguez felt his heart rate increase as they moved through the empty street. The silence was broken only by their boots on the broken pavement and the distant sound of generators humming in nearby buildings. As they got closer to the target building, Rodriguez noticed details that made him uncomfortable. Fresh tire tracks in the dust suggested recent vehicle activity. Curtains in several windows were positioned in ways that would provide perfect shooting positions. Most concerning was the complete absence of any sound from inside the building, despite clear evidence that people were present. "Something's not adding up here," Washington whispered as they took positions around the building's entrance. "Where is everyone? This street should have some activity, even with us here." The woman in the window had moved, but Rodriguez could still see her shadow behind the curtain. She seemed to be pacing, and occasionally he caught glimpses of her holding what looked like a radio or phone. The sight made his stomach tighten with worry. Torres signaled for the team to hold their position while he tried to establish communication with the civilians. He called out in Arabic, asking them to come to the window so they could talk. For several minutes, there was no response. Then slowly, the woman appeared again. She looked directly at Torres and began speaking rapidly in Arabic. Rodriguez couldn't understand the words, but her tone suggested urgency, even desperation. She kept pointing toward the back of the building and making gestures that seemed to indicate they should leave immediately. "She's trying to warn us about something," Torres concluded after listening for a moment. "Says there are bad men in the building and we need to go away before something terrible happens." The team exchanged glances. If the woman was telling the truth, they had walked into exactly the kind of situation they had been trying to avoid. If she was lying or being forced to mislead them, they were already in the trap. Chen made the decision to withdraw slightly while they reassessed the situation. As they moved back toward their vehicles, Rodriguez kept watching the window where the woman had appeared. She was still there, and now she was holding the child while frantically waving at them to leave. "I think she's legitimate," Rodriguez told his teammates. "Look at her body language. She's scared, but not of us. She's scared for us." Before anyone could respond, the situation changed dramatically. The back door of the building burst open, and several armed men in civilian clothes rushed out. They weren't running toward the SEAL team, though. They were running away from the building, carrying weapons and what looked like communication equipment. "Runners," Chen shouted into her radio. Multiple armed individuals fleeing the target building from the rear exit. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The building had been used as a staging area or communication hub, but the insurgents were abandoning it quickly. The family upstairs wasn't there by choice. They had been held to make the building appear occupied by civilians. As the armed men disappeared into the maze of back alleys behind the building, the woman in the window became more agitated. She was shouting now, pointing not toward where the men had fled but toward the street where the SEAL team stood. Torres listened carefully to her words, and his expression changed to one of alarm. "She says there are bombs," he translated quickly. "Hidden in the street. We need to move now." The realization hit the team like ice water. They weren't just in an ambush zone. They were standing in a minefield. The word bombs hung in the air like a death sentence. Torres immediately began barking orders for the team to freeze in place, while he tried to get more information from the woman in the window. Every step they took now could be their last, and everyone knew it. Rodriguez felt his mouth go dry as he looked down at the ground beneath his feet. The street looked normal enough. Broken concrete, scattered debris, the usual urban decay of a war zone. But now every crack in the pavement seemed suspicious, every piece of rubble potentially deadly. "How many?" Torres called up to the woman in Arabic. "Where are they?" The woman, whose name they would later learn was Amira, began pointing frantically at different spots in the street. Her gestures suggested that the explosives were scattered in a pattern designed to catch vehicles and foot patrols alike. She held up her hands repeatedly, showing different numbers of fingers, trying to communicate the locations of each device. "I count at least 6 different spots she's indicating," Washington observed quietly. "We're standing in the middle of a kill zone." Chen's voice crackled through the radio from her position near the vehicles. "EOD team is 20 minutes out. Can you hold position until they arrive?" Torres looked around at his men, all frozen in place like statues. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours when any movement could trigger an explosion. But they had no choice. Moving without knowing the exact locations of the explosives would be suicide. "Copy that," Torres responded. "We'll hold position. But this woman is our only source of information right now, and we need to keep her talking." Amira seemed to understand the gravity of the situation even without speaking English. She had stopped her frantic pointing and was now speaking more slowly and clearly. Torres listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify what she was telling him. "She says the men who just fled forced her family to stay in the building." Torres translated for his team. "They told them that if any family members left or tried to warn anyone, they would kill her children. But when she saw us walking into the trap, she couldn't stay quiet." Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. This woman had risked her children's lives to warn complete strangers about danger. The courage that took was almost incomprehensible. "Ask her how she knows about the bombs," Rodriguez suggested. "Did she see them plant the devices?" Torres relayed the question, and Amira's response came quickly. She gestured toward the back of the building where the armed men had fled, then pointed to her eyes and made a watching motion. She had been observing from her window as the insurgents prepared their ambush. She watched them dig holes and place the devices over the past 2 days, Torres explained. "Says they worked mostly at night, using the building as a base of operations. Her family was brought here 3 days ago and told they had to stay." The situation was becoming clearer, but it wasn't getting any less dangerous. The SEAL team was trapped in a carefully planned killing field, saved only by the moral courage of a woman who had chosen to protect strangers rather than follow the threats made against her family. Washington, who had been scanning the surrounding buildings for additional threats, suddenly tensed. "Movement in the building across the street," he reported quietly. "Second floor, third window from the left." All eyes turned toward the building he had indicated. Sure enough, there was a figure in the shadows behind a partially closed window. The person seemed to be watching their situation unfold, but it was impossible to tell if it was another civilian or a potential threat. Could be a spotter, Chen's voice came through the radio. Someone left behind to trigger the devices or coordinate follow-up attacks. Torres called up to Amira again, asking if she knew about other people in the area. Her response was immediate and alarmed. She pointed toward the building Washington had identified and began speaking rapidly. Her voice filled with fear. "She says that's where the leader was staying," Torres translated. "The man who threatened her family. She thought he had left with the others, but maybe he stayed behind." The implications were terrifying. If the insurgent leader was still in the area, he might be waiting to detonate the explosives manually. The SEAL team wasn't just standing in a minefield. They were being watched by someone who might have his finger on the trigger. Rodriguez felt sweat running down his back despite the relatively cool morning air. The tactical situation had gone from bad to worse, and they were running out of options. The EOD team was still 15 minutes away, and every second felt like an eternity. "We need to make contact with whoever's in that building," Chen decided. "If it's hostile, we need to know now. If it's another civilian, they might be in danger too." Torres nodded and began calling out toward the building in Arabic, identifying himself as American military and asking for a response. For several long moments there was silence. Then, slowly, a man appeared in the window. He was older than the insurgents who had fled, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and traditional robes. He looked terrified and began speaking quickly, gesturing toward his own building and then toward the street where the SEAL team stood. "He's saying there are more bombs," Torres translated with growing concern. "Not just in the street, but in his building too. Says the insurgents told him they would blow up the whole block if anyone interfered with their operation." The scope of the trap was becoming apparent. This wasn't just an ambush targeting one patrol. It was a coordinated attack designed to cause maximum casualties and destruction. The insurgents had essentially turned an entire city block into a weapon. Amira, who had been listening to the conversation between Torres and the man in the other building, suddenly became even more agitated. She began pointing toward different buildings and making explosion gestures with her hands. Her message was clear. The entire area was rigged to explode. "How many civilians are we talking about?" Rodriguez asked Torres. "How many people are trapped in this area?" Torres posed the question to both Amira and the man in the other building. Their responses painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege. Families had been forced to stay in their homes, threatened with death if they tried to leave. The insurgents had essentially created a human shield around their bombing operation. "At least 30 people," Torres reported grimly, "spread across 5 or 6 buildings, all being held in place by threats against their children." Chen's voice came through the radio with an update that offered little comfort. "EOD team is delayed. They're dealing with another situation on the other side of the city. Could be another hour before they reach us." An hour. Rodriguez closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. They couldn't stand motionless in a minefield for an hour, while dozens of innocent people remained trapped in rigged buildings. Something had to be done, but any action they took could trigger a disaster. That's when Amira made a decision that would change everything. She handed her child to the older man in her apartment and began climbing out of the window onto a narrow ledge that ran along the second story of her building. Her intent was clear. She was going to try to help them identify the exact locations of the explosives. "No!" Torres shouted in Arabic as he watched Amira climb onto the narrow ledge outside her window. "Too dangerous."
"Stay inside!"
But Amira had made up her mind. She moved carefully along the ledge, using cracks in the building's facade for handholds. Her intent became clear as she began pointing more precisely at specific spots in the street below, calling down information about the hidden explosives. Rodriguez watched in amazement and terror as this brave woman risked her life to help them. The ledge was barely 6 inches wide, and one slip would mean a 20-foot fall onto concrete. But she continued moving, providing detailed information about each bomb's location. "She's marking them with rocks," Washington observed. Amira was indeed dropping small stones from her position, each one landing near a concealed explosive device. "Look, she's being incredibly specific about the positions." Torres was frantically taking notes and relaying the information to Chen, who was marking the locations on a tactical map. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The bombs were positioned to create a kill zone that would trap any military patrol that entered the street, while also blocking all escape routes. 6 devices confirmed. Chen reported over the radio, arranged in a box formation with overlapping blast radiuses. Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing. As Amira continued her dangerous work, movement in the building across the street caught everyone's attention. The figure they had spotted earlier was now clearly visible in the window, and he was holding what appeared to be a radio or detonation device. "That's him," Torres said grimly, recognizing the threat immediately. "If he triggers those devices now, everyone in the blast radius dies, including all the civilians." The insurgent leader seemed to be watching Amira's efforts with growing anger. He began shouting at her in Arabic, clearly ordering her to stop helping the Americans. His voice carried clearly across the narrow street filled with rage and threats. Amira paused on the ledge, looking toward the man in the window. For a moment, Rodriguez thought she might climb back inside to safety. But instead, she called back to the insurgent leader, her voice strong and defiant despite her precarious position. "She's telling him that innocent people don't deserve to die for his war," Torres translated, admiration clear in his voice. "She's saying that children shouldn't pay the price for adult conflicts." The insurgent's response was immediate and chilling. He raised what was clearly a detonation device and began shouting that he would kill everyone if Amira didn't stop helping the Americans immediately. "He's got a dead man's switch," Washington realized with growing dread. "If we take him out, he might trigger the explosives as he falls." The tactical situation had become impossible. They couldn't move because of the explosives beneath their feet. They couldn't take out the threat because doing so might trigger the very disaster they were trying to prevent. And they couldn't ask Amira to stop helping because they still needed more information to safely navigate the minefield. Chen's voice crackled through the radio with an update that made everything worse. "Aerial surveillance shows 3 more armed individuals approaching your position from the east. They're moving fast and carrying heavy weapons. You've got maybe 5 minutes before they arrive." Rodriguez felt his heart sink. The insurgents weren't just planning to detonate the explosives. They were sending reinforcements to make sure no one survived the ambush. The trap was closing and time was running out. "Amira needs to get back inside," Torres decided. "She's given us enough information. Now she needs to protect herself and her family." But as Torres began calling for Amira to return to her window, the insurgent leader across the street made his move. He began rapidly pressing buttons on his device, apparently trying to trigger the explosives immediately. Nothing happened. The man pressed the buttons again, more frantically this time. Still nothing. He began shaking the device and shouting in frustration. Something had gone wrong with his plan. "Technical malfunction," Chen observed from her position. "The detonation system isn't working properly. That's giving us a window of opportunity, but it won't last long." Amira seemed to understand what was happening. Instead of climbing back to safety, she began moving more quickly along the ledge, dropping stones to mark the remaining explosive locations. She was racing against time, knowing that the insurgent might get his detonation system working at any moment. "She's identified 8 devices now," Torres reported. "More than we initially thought. This whole block is wired to explode." The sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance. The reinforcements Chen had spotted were getting closer. Rodriguez could also hear the insurgent leader shouting into a radio, apparently calling for technical support to fix his detonation system. "We need an extraction plan," Washington said quietly. "Even if we can avoid the bombs in the street, those reinforcements are going to pin us down." Torres was already working on that problem, using the information Amira had provided to plot a safe path back to their vehicles. The route would require precise movements and perfect timing, but it was possible. "There's a clear corridor along the east side of the street," he explained to his team, "but it's narrow and we'll have to move single file. One mistake and we're all dead." As he spoke, Amira suddenly cried out from her position on the ledge. She had spotted something that made her wave frantically at the Americans below. Following her gaze, Rodriguez saw what had alarmed her. The insurgent leader was no longer alone in his window. 2 other armed men had joined him, and one of them was working on what appeared to be a backup detonation system. They hadn't given up on their plan. They were just switching to a different method of triggering the explosives. "They've got a manual firing system," Chen reported after observing the situation through binoculars. "Looks like they can trigger individual devices or set them all off at once." The margin for survival was shrinking rapidly. The approaching reinforcements, the backup detonation system, and Amira's increasingly dangerous position on the ledge all combined to create a crisis that demanded immediate action. That's when Amira made another decision that would change the course of events. Instead of climbing back to safety, she began moving along the ledge toward the building where the insurgent leader was positioned. Her intention was unclear, but her determination was evident. "What is she doing?" Rodriguez asked Torres urgently. Torres called up to her in Arabic, asking about her intentions. Her response came back clear and firm, spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. "She says the detonation device needs to be destroyed before more people get hurt," Torres translated with growing concern. "She's going to try to get into that building and stop them herself." The courage was unbelievable, but the plan was essentially suicide. Amira was risking everything to protect not just the SEAL team, but all the civilians trapped in the surrounding buildings. She had appointed herself the protector of innocent lives, regardless of the cost to her own safety. Rodriguez watched in horror as Amira began making her way along the ledge toward the insurgents' building. The gap between buildings was at least 8 feet, too far to jump safely, especially from such a narrow perch. But she seemed determined to find a way across. "She's going to get herself killed," Washington whispered, voicing what everyone was thinking. Torres continued calling to her in Arabic, trying to convince her to return to safety. But Amira had spotted something the others had missed. Between her building and the insurgents' hideout, there was an old clothesline stretched across the narrow alley. The thick rope looked sturdy enough to support her weight, but using it would require incredible courage and skill. "No way," Rodriguez breathed as he realized what she was planning. "She's going to try to cross on that rope." The insurgent leader had also noticed Amira's movement and was becoming increasingly agitated. He began shouting threats across the alley, waving his weapon in her direction. But he couldn't fire at her without risking the detonation of his own explosives. The buildings were too close together, and a stray bullet could hit one of the devices. Chen's voice came through the radio with increasing urgency. "Those reinforcements are 2 minutes out. Whatever we're going to do, it has to happen now." Amira had reached the point where the clothesline was anchored to her building. She tested the rope carefully, pulling on it to check its strength. The line sagged slightly under pressure but seemed solid enough to hold her weight. Taking a deep breath, she began to climb out onto the rope. "This is insane," Torres muttered, but Rodriguez could hear the admiration in his voice. They were watching someone risk everything for complete strangers, and the courage was both inspiring and terrifying. The insurgent leader was now screaming at Amira, ordering her to stop. When she continued moving along the rope, he made a fatal mistake. In his anger and frustration, he leaned out of his window to get a better angle to threaten her, exposing his position to the SEAL team below. "I've got a shot," Washington reported quietly, raising his rifle. "Clean line of sight to the primary target." "Negative," Torres responded immediately. "If he falls on that detonation device, he could trigger everything accidentally. We need him alive and away from the controls." But Washington had spotted something else that changed the equation. "There's a second device on the table behind him. Looks like a backup system. Even if we take him out, someone else could still trigger the explosives." The tactical situation was becoming impossible to solve through conventional means. Every option seemed to lead to the same result: massive casualties among the civilian population, and the likely deaths of everyone in the immediate area. Amira had made it halfway across the rope when the unthinkable happened. The insurgent leader, in his desperation to stop her, grabbed a small explosive device from the table and threatened to throw it down into the street where the SEAL team was trapped. "Grenade!" Torres shouted, recognizing the threat immediately. But Amira had seen it too. Instead of retreating back along the rope to safety, she did something that defied all logic and self-preservation. She began moving faster toward the insurgent's window, apparently planning to prevent him from throwing the explosive. The insurgent leader was so focused on Amira's approach that he momentarily forgot about the Americans below. He pulled the pin on the grenade and raised it to throw, but Amira reached his window at exactly that moment. What happened next occurred so quickly that Rodriguez almost missed it. Amira somehow managed to grab the insurgent's arm as he prepared to throw the grenade, causing him to lose his balance. The explosive device fell inside the building instead of into the street, and the insurgent leader tumbled backward into his room. The explosion that followed was contained within the building, but it was powerful enough to shake the entire structure. Smoke poured from the window where the insurgent leader had been positioned, and debris rained down into the alley between buildings. "Amira," Torres called out in Arabic, desperately trying to locate her in the chaos. For several terrifying seconds, there was no response. The clothesline had snapped during the explosion, and there was no sign of movement from either building. Rodriguez felt his heart sink, fearing that this brave woman had paid the ultimate price for her heroism. Then faintly, they heard her voice calling from inside the insurgents' building. She was alive, but her situation had gone from dangerous to desperate. She was now trapped inside a damaged structure with armed insurgents, and the approaching reinforcements would be arriving at any moment. "She's pinned down on the second floor," Torres reported after listening to her calls for help. "Says there are 2 insurgents still alive in there with her, and the stairs are blocked by debris from the explosion." Chen's update from the vehicles made everything more urgent. "Reinforcements are 1 minute out. We need to move now or we're all trapped here." The moral dilemma was agonizing. Amira had saved their lives by preventing the insurgent from throwing the grenade into the street, but now she needed rescue herself. The safe route Torres had plotted would take them away from her location, but staying to help her meant facing the incoming reinforcements with no cover and limited ammunition. "We can't leave her," Rodriguez stated firmly. "She risked everything to save us. We owe her the same." Washington nodded in agreement. "She's got kids in the building across the street. If we abandon her now, what happens to them?" Torres was already modifying their tactical plan. New objective: rescue the civilian and neutralize remaining threats in the target building. We use the explosion damage to our advantage and go in through the hole that was blown in the wall. It was a desperate plan that violated every principle of safe tactical operations. They would be entering a damaged building with unknown structural integrity, facing an unknown number of insurgents, while reinforcements approached their position. The odds of success were minimal, but as Rodriguez looked up at the building where Amira was trapped, he knew they had no choice. This woman had shown them what real courage looked like, and they couldn't respond with anything less than the same level of commitment. "Chen, we need covering fire on our approach to the building," Torres called through the radio. "And see if you can delay those reinforcements somehow." "Copy that," Chen responded. "But you've got maybe 3 minutes before this whole area becomes untenable." As the team prepared to move across the minefield using Amira's carefully marked safe route, Rodriguez thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this point. A routine reconnaissance mission had become a rescue operation, all because one woman had chosen courage over fear, compassion over self-preservation. The first shots of incoming fire echoed through the streets as the reinforcements arrived at the edge of the neighborhood. The battle for Amira's life and their own survival was about to begin. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from the east end of the street as Chen engaged the approaching reinforcements. Her covering fire gave the trapped SEAL team the distraction they needed to begin moving across the minefield that Amira had so carefully mapped for them. Rodriguez followed, Torres in single file along the narrow safe corridor, stepping exactly where Amira's dropped stones indicated clear ground. Each step felt like it might be his last, but the woman's precision had been perfect. Behind him, Washington moved with equal care, his rifle trained on the damaged building where Amira was trapped. "Movement on the second floor," Washington reported quietly. "Someone's alive up there and they're moving toward the front of the building." As they approached the blast-damaged wall, they could hear voices from inside, some in Arabic, some that might have been Amira trying to communicate. The explosion had torn a hole large enough for them to enter, but they had no idea what they would find inside. Torres took point as they moved through the breach in the wall. The interior of the building was a maze of fallen concrete, twisted metal, and smoke. The acrid smell of explosives hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe. Emergency lighting from outside filtered through the damaged windows, creating an eerie patchwork of shadows. "Amira," Torres called out in Arabic, identifying himself as American military and asking for her location. Her response came from somewhere above them, but it was weak and strained. She was definitely hurt but alive. More concerning were the other voices they could hear, at least 2 men speaking in urgent, angry tones. Rodriguez spotted a partially collapsed staircase leading to the second floor. The structure looked unstable, but it appeared to be their only way up. "This whole building could come down if we're not careful," he warned his teammates. As they began climbing the damaged stairs, the sound of Chen's firefight outside intensified. The reinforcements were pushing hard to reach their position, and her ammunition wouldn't last forever. Time was running out quickly. "American soldiers," a voice called out from the second floor in heavily accented English. "You stop now or woman dies." The threat was clear, but it also gave them valuable information. The surviving insurgents were using Amira as a human shield, which meant she was still alive and in a position where they could threaten her. It also meant the insurgents were desperate enough to negotiate, which might give the SEAL team an advantage. Torres reached the second floor first and immediately assessed the situation. Through a doorway partially blocked by debris, he could see into what had been the main room. Two insurgents, both wounded from the explosion, were holding Amira near the damaged window. One had a pistol pointed at her head while the other held what looked like another detonation device. "They still have explosives," Torres whispered back to his team, "and they're threatening to kill her if we don't withdraw." The tactical situation was nearly impossible. A direct assault would likely result in Amira's death, but retreating meant abandoning her to whatever fate the insurgents had planned. The sound of approaching footsteps on the stairs behind them indicated that more insurgents might be entering the building from another route. That's when Amira herself changed the dynamics of the situation. Despite having a gun to her head, she began speaking loudly in Arabic, apparently trying to convince her captors to release the other civilians in the neighborhood. Her voice was strong despite her obvious fear, and she seemed to be arguing with them about something. "What's she saying?" Rodriguez asked Torres urgently. "She's telling them that killing innocent people won't change anything," Torres translated with amazement. "She says that if they want to fight Americans, they should fight soldiers, not families. She's actually trying to negotiate for the other civilians." Even in mortal danger, this remarkable woman was thinking about protecting others. The insurgent holding the gun was becoming increasingly agitated by her words, shouting back at her and pressing the weapon harder against her head. Washington had positioned himself to cover the stairs behind them, and suddenly tensed. More movement below. Sounds like at least 3 more hostiles entering the building. They were about to be trapped between 2 groups of insurgents, with an unstable building ready to collapse around them, and a civilian whose life hung in the balance. The sound of Chen's covering fire outside was becoming more sporadic, suggesting she was running low on ammunition or being forced to change position. "Chen, what's your status?" Torres called through his radio. "Heavy resistance," came her reply between bursts of gunfire. "I can hold them for maybe 2 more minutes, then I have to fall back." "You need to get out of that building now." But leaving wasn't an option with Amira still held hostage. Rodriguez studied the room layout through the partially blocked doorway, looking for any tactical advantage they could exploit. The explosion had weakened the floor structure and parts of the ceiling had collapsed, creating new cover positions and sight lines. That's when he noticed something that might change everything. The detonation device the second insurgent was holding appeared to have been damaged in the explosion. Wires were hanging loose from its casing, and the man seemed to be having trouble with its operation, much like the leader had experienced earlier. "Their electronics are fried," Rodriguez realized. The explosion knocked out their detonation systems. This information gave Torres an idea for a desperate gambit. If the insurgents couldn't actually trigger their explosives, their main leverage was gone. The threat to Amira was still real, but they might be more willing to negotiate if they knew their position was hopeless. "Tell them their detonation system is broken," Torres instructed Rodriguez. "Let them know we can see the damage to their equipment," Rodriguez called out in the little Arabic he knew, pointing toward the damaged device and making it clear they understood it wasn't functional. The effect was immediate. Both insurgents began examining their equipment more closely, confirming what the Americans had observed. The insurgent with the gun began arguing with his partner, apparently debating whether to continue holding their position or try to escape. During their distraction, Amira caught Torres's eye through the doorway and made a subtle gesture toward her right side. Following her indication, Torres spotted something crucial. There was another hole in the wall from the explosion, partially hidden behind hanging debris. It led to an adjacent room that might provide a flanking position. If they could reach it without being detected, they might be able to catch the insurgents off guard. "Cover me," Torres whispered to Rodriguez. "I'm going to try to get around behind them." As Torres began moving carefully toward the hidden opening, the sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Washington prepared to engage the insurgents climbing toward their position, but doing so would alert the hostage takers to their presence. The timing had to be perfect. Chen's covering fire outside was becoming more intermittent, suggesting the reinforcements were gaining ground. The insurgents below were almost to their floor, and somewhere in the chaos they still had to save Amira and get everyone out alive. That's when the unthinkable happened. As Torres reached the hidden opening in the wall, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The insurgents on the stairs had made contact with Washington. The hostage-takers in the main room were shooting at shadows, and return fire was coming through the windows from outside. In the confusion of the firefight, 15 shots were fired in rapid succession, some from the insurgents, some from the SEAL team, and some from the ongoing battle outside. When the shooting stopped, an eerie silence fell over the damaged building. Rodriguez's heart sank as he realized what the silence might mean. In firefights like this, civilian casualties were tragically common. The woman who had risked everything to save them might have become another victim of the violence she had tried to prevent. The silence after 15 shots lasted only seconds, but to Rodriguez it felt like hours. His ears were ringing from the confined space gunfire, and smoke from the weapons filled the already damaged room. Through the haze and debris, he strained to see any sign of movement from where Amira had been held. "Status report," Torres called out from his flanking position. Washington responded first. "2 hostiles down on the stairway. Area secure behind us." Rodriguez moved carefully toward the main room, his weapon ready but his heart pounding with fear about what he might find. The insurgent who had been holding the pistol to Amira's head was on the ground, motionless. His partner lay nearby, the damaged detonation device scattered in pieces around him. But where was Amira? "Over here," came a weak voice in English from behind an overturned table. Rodriguez felt a wave of relief wash over him as he spotted movement in the shadows. Amira was alive, though clearly shaken and hurt. She had managed to dive for cover when the shooting started, using the chaos to escape from her captors. There was blood on her arm from what looked like a graze from flying debris, but she was conscious and alert. "Are you badly injured?" Rodriguez asked as he moved to help her. She shook her head, struggling to sit up. "My arm hurts, but I am okay. The children, my children in the other building, are they safe?" Even after everything she had endured, her first concern was for her family. Torres was already on his radio, coordinating with Chen to check on the civilians in the surrounding buildings. The explosives in the street were still active, but without functional detonation devices, they posed less immediate threat. "Chen, we need EOD support for civilian evacuation," Torres called through his radio. "The primary threats are neutralized, but we still have active explosives throughout the area." "Copy that," Chen responded. "Reinforcement threat is contained. I've got backup units moving in to secure the perimeter. EOD team is finally en route. Should be here in 10 minutes. As they helped Amira to her feet, Rodriguez marveled at what this woman had accomplished. Her warnings had saved the SEAL team from walking into a deadly trap. Her courage in crossing between buildings had prevented a grenade attack that would have killed everyone on the street. And her final act of drawing the insurgents' attention had given the team the opening they needed to neutralize the threats. "Why did you risk so much for us?" Rodriguez asked her as they prepared to evacuate the building. "You didn't know us. We were just strangers." Amira looked at him with eyes that held both exhaustion and determination. "Because children should not grow up in a world where good people do nothing when they see evil. My children were watching from the window. What kind of mother would I be if I taught them to stay silent when innocent people need help?" Her words hit Rodriguez with unexpected force. In a war zone where trust was rare and survival often meant looking out for yourself first, this woman had chosen to embody the best of human nature. She had shown that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about doing what was right despite being afraid. Torres had found a relatively safe route out of the building that avoided the most unstable sections. As they made their way back to the ground floor, they could hear the sounds of military vehicles arriving to secure the area. The immediate crisis was over, but the work of clearing the explosives and ensuring civilian safety was just beginning. "The other families," Amira said as they reached the ground floor. "They are still afraid to leave their homes. They need to know it is safe now." Washington nodded. "We'll make sure everyone gets evacuated safely. No one else is going to be hurt today." As they emerged from the damaged building into the dusty street, Rodriguez saw the full scope of what had been prevented. Military engineers were already marking the locations of explosive devices, using the information Amira had provided from her dangerous perch on the building ledge. Without her detailed mapping, the EOD team would have needed hours to locate all the hidden bombs. Chen approached as they reached the street, relief evident on her face. "Outstanding work," she told her team. Then she turned to Amira and spoke in Arabic, thanking her for her courage and asking about her medical needs. Amira's response brought tears to Chen's eyes. "She says she doesn't need thanks," Chen translated. "She says that protecting innocent people is not heroic, it's just human." An army medic arrived to examine Amira's injuries while Rodriguez watched the EOD team begin their methodical work of disarming the explosives. Each device they safely removed represented lives that had been saved by one woman's extraordinary courage. Over the next hour, families began emerging from buildings throughout the neighborhood. Parents carried children who had been hidden in back rooms. Elderly couples helped each other navigate the debris-filled streets. All of them had been held prisoner in their own homes by threats of violence, and all of them owed their freedom to Amira's decision to act when action was needed. The man from the building across the street approached Amira as she was being treated by the medic. Rodriguez watched as the elderly gentleman took her hands and spoke earnestly to her in Arabic. Chen translated his words. "He says she is the bravest person he has ever known, and that his grandchildren will grow up hearing the story of the woman who saved their neighborhood." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the street, Rodriguez reflected on the day's events. They had started with a routine mission and ended with witnessing one of the most remarkable acts of courage he had ever seen. 15 shots had been fired in the final confrontation, but through a combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, the most important life had been spared. Amira was reunited with her children as the last of the explosives was safely removed from the street. Rodriguez watched the family embrace, thinking about the lessons this day had taught him. In a world often dominated by violence and hatred, it was possible for individual acts of courage to change everything. The woman who had risked her life for strangers would return to her daily routine, raising her children and trying to build a normal life in a war-torn city, but her example would live on in the memories of everyone who witnessed her courage. She had shown them that heroism wasn't about wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. It was about choosing compassion over fear, action over passivity, and hope over despair. Years later, whenever Rodriguez faced difficult decisions in his own life, he would remember the woman on the ledge in Fallujah who had taught him what real courage looked like. He would remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to do what is right, regardless of the cost. Amira had taken 15 shots fired in anger and chaos and somehow emerged alive, not through luck alone, but through the kind of moral courage that makes ordinary people extraordinary. Her story would become legend among the soldiers who served in Iraq, passed down as an example of the incredible things that happen when someone chooses to act with pure, selfless bravery. In the end, she had saved not just the SEAL team, but an entire neighborhood. More importantly, she had reminded everyone who knew her story that heroes are not born. They are made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things.